Hello, I'm Eric Corman, Communications Director at League of Education Voters. Welcome to our free online webinar series, Lunchtime LEVinars. We started this series nearly 5 years ago to share information and build knowledge on important and timely issues. Today's webinar is on special education from a rural and urban perspective. During the 2019 legislative session, lawmakers have said that they will fully fund special education services in Washington state. Our speakers today are Davenport School District Superintendent Jim Kowalkowski and Stacy Dim, Executive Director of the ARC of King County. They will give an overview of which special education services are currently being provided in their respective regions and what is still needed. They will also answer your questions. Jim Kowalkowski serves as the superintendent for the small and rural Davenport School District in Eastern Washington. He has served as superintendent and a superintendent in our state for over 20 years. His K-12 district currently has 545 students enrolled, and his schools have received several School of Distinction awards. Graduation rates the past 3 years are as follows: 97%, 97%, and 100%. That's amazing. Davenport is currently serving 70 special education students who represent 12.56% of their total student population. He is also the director of the Rural Education Center, a cooperative of more than 75 small and rural districts all across the state, and is affiliated with Washington State University's College of Education and Educational Service District 101. Stacy Dim has a 30-year history in the disability rights field and is currently the executive director of the ARC of King County. She previously worked for Governor Inslee as the Washington State Education Ombuds, resolving complaints across the state regarding public education. Prior to her policy and legislative work in education, Stacy worked at the DeSalt Law Group, specializing in litigation support and mediation to assist families and educators to understand the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, and student civil rights under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Early in her career, Stacy was a special education teacher, and she is currently a member of the advisory committee to the University of Washington Center for Excellence in Developmental Disability, and most recently served on the Washington State Disability Task Force. She co-authored a legal guide for families and educators and has contributed to numerous articles for state and national conferences, public information brochures, newsletters, and manuals. Stacy is a sibling and co-guardian for her sister with a developmental disability. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. You'll notice a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. This is a space for you to submit questions to us. And as always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us on the chat function or at info@educationvoters.org. Welcome, Jim and Stacy. The floor is yours.
Eric, thank you again. This is Jim Kowalkowski, and before I started, I wanted to give a special shout out to Stacy. She helped get Kevin's Law passed in 2005, and if you're not aware of what that is, that's allow special ed students that may need to stay in school longer, past their graduating class, to get more assistance. They can still go through graduation ceremonies with their class, and that was an historic bill and law that got passed. So Stacy, I know it was a lot of people, but you were a big part of that, so a big shout out to her. Again, as Eric said, I wanted to give a special thanks to also the League of Education Voters for spotlighting special ed. I'm glad we're finally getting some interest from legislators and some recognition that we need to fund special ed better. And I look at funding as just resources, and we need more resources. Next slide, please. And you can click it one more time, Eric. This is how many of us are feeling, rural, urban, big and small. And this is all the changes in education funding, the loss of the salary schedule, the loss of the staff mix, the loss of levy funds. I've been a superintendent for 20 years, and I have never been this worried about school funding. I know at the end of the day, kids are still going to show up and we got to serve them, but there is so much change going on. Next slide, please. As Eric mentioned, Davenport, we're the home of the gorillas, and I also serve as the Rural Ed Center Director. And we have over 80 small rural schools. What we do is we're just kind of We try to go to meetings, legislative things, policy things, and we try to jump up and down and say, don't forget the small rural schools. They're important too. Next slide. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. Most Washington districts are rural. I could define rural, but it's a complicated definition. Basically, if there's cows and barns and agriculture, it's probably and a little ways from a city center, it's probably considered rural. But we have 295 districts and 167 of them are rural. Next slide, please. The 12% of all districts of all students are in rural districts. So the majority of kids are either in suburban, urban, or town, but we do have 12% of students in our state that live in rural districts. Next. 1/3 of all districts in Washington have fewer than 350 students. And that's something that a lot of folks don't know. We are a state of small districts. We used to have over 3,000 school districts in our state. When there was a county superintendent would ride his horse to check out the towns and the schools, but that's just an interesting fact. Next. And most rural districts are small. We typically use the terms interchangeably, even though we do have some rural districts that are larger. The average size students, K-12 for a rural district, the average enrollment is 924. And you can see the different ranges there. Next. This is my opinion, but I believe it to be true. There is a myth that rural schools shortchange special ed students. And there's a link on this. You can click on the Seattle Times, and they published an editorial years ago, and I did an op-ed in response to it, and it's on the next slide. And this was my response. This was in 2010 when there was a big push from Governor Gregoire and some legislators to consolidate small schools to save money. And the Seattle Times editorial said, more intensive student needs often go unserved. Excuse me, it was talking about special ed services, stating more intensive student needs often go unserved. Well, I took exception to that, and I asked in my editorial, my op-ed, are you saying that small districts do a poor job of providing services to special ed students? To assume that just because a small school district is small, its students will be shortchanged is wrong. In fact, many special needs students thrive in small districts. Next. The benefits of small and rural districts, and Stacy and I, we've communicated recently lately, and we're not saying small is better or large is better, urban's better, rural's better. We're all here to serve kids. But some things that, with some small and rural districts, we generally have smaller class sizes. We have personalized learning, not that bigger districts don't, but like in my school, I know most of the kids, most of the parents, and I used to work in a Ferndale, which is a much larger district, and I didn't necessarily know all the kids. We have more of a family type setting, and inclusion is sometimes easier. Next slide, please. Some challenges, and these are also other size districts, particularly special ed teachers working in small rural district. Isolation, often you might be the only teacher working, and if it's a small district, doing the special ed, providing services. Budget constraints, difficulty in finding specialists, and this is an issue statewide, but in particular for small schools, OT, PT, SLP, etc. The ESDs provide great support, but it is challenging if you only need, say, OT for maybe a third of the week or 1 day a week to try to find those specialists. And recruiting, hiring, and retaining for teachers is very difficult. I did want to let folks know that Professional Education Standards Board just published and I didn't put the link on, but just published if you go to this PESB website, it's the data and story, educator shortage in Washington State. And if you have a chance, I would encourage all the folks to read through that. But it talks about the challenges of finding teachers of color, which is a challenge right now, but also the difficulty in finding CTE teachers, which is, I think, the highest concern shortage area, and the second one is the special ed teachers. So that's a difficult finding teachers to teach special ed. But if you have a chance to read that report, I would strongly encourage it. Next, please. Funding, as I mentioned earlier, is just resources for kids. More funding is needed for rural schools, urban schools, large schools, doesn't matter what part of the state. we're a long ways from fully funding special ed. Anyone that has worked in special ed knows that. I wanted to quickly give a story of a student we had several years ago. He was completely deaf, and he transferred to us in 9th grade from another district. And initially we were like, oh my gosh, we had a difficult time finding an interpreter. In the whole Spokane region, we couldn't find anybody. They were all busy. So we contracted with a company out of Oklahoma, and the young man also played 2 different sports. We tried having his dad be an interpreter for football, but the dad and the football coach didn't get along. So we hired the interpreter to also do the interpreting for sports. So the total cost, and this student was completely deaf, but a really, really interesting young man, and a very kind student that we learned a lot from. But we went from how can we afford this to, wait a minute, we've got to provide services. That's in the IEP, a full-time interpreter. We're going to do it. We're not going to complain about it. But we spent almost $100,000 on that one student, and then, which is what we needed to do. We were able to get some safety net funding, and the safety net process, I had never gone through that before. And my best example is, this is nuts. It's worse than getting 5 root canals in one day. Anyhow, but there needs to be some a little improvement in safety net funding. I think the state's looking at that, trying to improve that. Next slide, please. I typed this up over this weekend, so there's already been a change, but Senate Bill 5901 would increase the excess cost multiplier from 0.96 to 0.98, and the bill actually amended it to 1.0, which would actually help quite a bit, providing some additional resources to districts. And the House just had their bill. They presented their education budget yesterday. Their proposed operating budget, and that included, for education for K-12, the multiplier going from 0.9609 to 0.9925, which is an increase. It's about $71 million statewide. But the OSPI has estimated there's a $300 million shortage statewide from state funding, federal funding, and what is actually needed by districts. Next slide, please. And then this is just sharing your stories. What's your story? And the reason I'm saying this is that legislators, like, their intentions are good, but they often only know what they know or what they hear. And I think it's important, those of you that are engaged out there, to tell the stories, whether it be you as a parent and your story of maybe a challenge with the school system, or if you're in a school system, the challenge of getting the resources we need so we can really help these kids. And I think that is the end of my part of this before the Q&A.
Yep, it sure is. Thank you so much, Jim. That was great.
Thank you.
You bet. Stacy, you ready to go?
Yeah, sure, Jim. That was fantastic. And thank you, Eric, for the lovely introduction. I have so much enjoyed getting to know Jim over this process. We don't always get to connect as much as we should between the east side and the west side, and I just love this opportunity. So thanks for setting it up. If you want to go to my second slide, I'll just explain for a minute what the ARC of King County is, in case people don't know what ARCs are. We were founded by families in 1937, so we like to say we're the oldest nonprofit related to helping people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And these were families who, by and large, their children were institutionalized early on in their lives, as soon as their earliest diagnosis, maybe as soon as they were born. And in our state early on, we have a legacy of institutionalization that actually led us to what we now know of as special education. So it's an important connection to make, I think. The ARC has evolved over time, as you could imagine, over decades of work with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. In fact, if you just look at the word ARC and how did we come up with that, it started off as the Benevolent League for Children and turned into the Association for Retarded Citizens in the 60s and 70s, which was quite a word of empowerment at the time. So the focus was really on the word citizens. And because over time the R word became associated with bullying and a certain level of stigma and low expectation, the ARC kind of rebranded itself nationally in the 80s and 90s. And so now we're just called the ARCs. And in King County, we're the largest ARC in Washington, but there are 9 chapters, including the state chapter. And we promote and protect the human and civil rights of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, supporting their full inclusion and participation in all aspects of society, believing that this is really a fundamental civil, moral, and constitutional right. So if you want to go to the next slide there, Jim. Oh, sorry, Eric, not Jim. So I always want to make this point that special education was really born out of the era of civil rights reform and constitutional-based cases. In our state, for example, we have 4 large institutions still for people with developmental disabilities. And at the end of the names of those institutions is the word school. So there's Fircrest School and Lakeland Village School and Yakima Valley School and Rainier School. And those were named schools because that's where kids with developmental disabilities got their education until the 1970s. And when we passed IDEA as a nation, before we did that in Washington State, we had our own law. It was called Education for All. And in Washington, we included children with disabilities in our public schools before anyone else did. And that's something to be proud of, although we did peak a little early. And since that time, I can't say that we've necessarily been a leader in some of the ways that we measure success for fully including people with developmental disabilities, kids with cognitive and intellectual disabilities, kids with multiple disabilities and autism that include cerebral palsy and epilepsy, Down syndrome, and other cognitive disabilities. So we have some work to still do, that's for sure. I like to say that people with developmental disabilities, children in particular, are probably the most criminalized, sterilized, euthanized, institutionalized, and marginalized group around if you look at the history of people with significant cognitive disabilities. And it really is something that we have to pay attention to in our public schools. Because at the ARC here, we help families from birth, sometimes prenatally when they get a prenatal diagnosis, all the way up through end of life. So we're helping families in their 80s and 90s who are still supporting their person, their loved one with cognitive disabilities that are in their 60s and 70s, still living at home, challenged by getting activities that are meaningful for them during the day and in getting employment. So education is a major part of setting the framework for the success of children who have cognitive and intellectual disabilities, autism, other behavioral disorders, and all children with disabilities really to be successful in employment and life. And Jim, are you on our value slide? You could go to the next one if you're in the word cloud. So it's really important that we address this issue because public schools are not only the place where children with disabilities learn critical life skills, but it's also where we train a whole new generation of children who become adults not to have the same stigma and bias about people with disabilities, and they just become part of the community when they're in schools and fully included. And that is what is most valuable for tackling what we consider to be the biggest problem for children and adults with intellectual and cognitive disabilities, and that is isolation and segregation. And unfortunately, until we address that in public schools successfully, we're probably not going to address it over the lifetime of an individual with a cognitive or an intellectual disability. And so if you want to move to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about our state funding system, just briefly, kind of in a nutshell. There's 3 ways that we really look at funding for special education in the state of Washington. We could first start at the federal government level, which feels like a frustrating conversation. Jim and I talked about it a little bit, and the percent of underfunding by the federal government has been persistent since the inception of the IDEA. They're still at only about 14% of the total cost, and the promise there was at 40%. And so that unfulfilled promise has a huge impact on children with disabilities in our public schools across the nation. Certainly a point of advocacy for all of us as we're speaking with our federal legislators about what they can do to help. In Washington in particular, though, I want to say there's 3 easy ways to look at it, although it reminds me of the song 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover. If there are 50 states, there are 50 ways to fund special education, and we have our own unique variety that is not necessarily any better or any worse than any other state. So the first is this special ed allocation that Jim mentioned. And the state legislature, for the first time in almost 25 years, is looking at fundamentally shifting that multiplier. So every kid that shows up gets counted. And then on top of that, if they have an IEP, there's a special education allocation. And that multiplier number is at 0.96 right now. It was slightly moved up from 0.93 2 years ago. And now they're talking about moving that to, sounds like 0.9925. I don't know why they couldn't come up with one, but must have been a few extra $1 million there that they thought they needed to preserve. But as Jim mentioned, OSPI is saying that to fill the gap, we need between $300 and $400 million towards special education that did not get included in the McCleary decision and the McCleary resolution. And it is, in my 30 years, this is the most I've heard special education talked about in terms of funding or policy across that time span. And it's for a lot of reasons. We have a new superintendent who really appreciates and understands kids with disabilities better. We have a new state director, Glenna Gallo, who comes from another state and has another perspective on how things can happen. And in addition, we did not solve this problem in McCleary, so we still have some issues to get through. The second issue that the legislation is trying to address this session is the safety net changes. So as Jim mentioned, you want to see that googly-eyed emoji. Every special ed director who deals with safety net goes through that. And the safety net really leaves too big of a gap in the amount of expense that a district has to assume before it can get reimbursement. And it's a lengthy wait time, so almost 18 months for districts to recover those costs, even when they can prove them out through this horrible process that is very onerous and makes it difficult for districts to engage in. And then the last third element that we're watching for is elimination of what we call the cap. And so our state says to school districts that you can only count 12.5% of your total population as students with disabilities, or you will not get the special education allocation for that student. And that primarily penalizes rural school districts. So if we look at the districts that went over the cap and did not get reimbursement for actual services they provided to students with disabilities, rural school districts definitely took the brunt of that. And that's not fair. Some would argue that the cap is unconstitutional. And in particular, some would argue, please at least eliminate the cap for rural school districts, because we know that it takes one student, as Jim described, to really tip a district over quite a bit. So if you could move to the next slide, Eric. Is that show 3 circles? How do we eliminate segregation?
This is the equality equity slide.
Oh, well, there's a slide missing in there, but I'll just speak really quickly. The next most important thing we do in education funding is to talk about outcomes. So we can throw a lot of money at this problem, but we still have to step back for a minute and look at, will that get us the outcomes we want for students with disabilities? Will it go toward more equity for students with disabilities so that they have access to learning environments that really helps them achieve outcomes? And right now we're a little limited in the outcomes that we assess for kids with disabilities. So on the upside, we want to look at, how does a smooth transition into post-school life look? So how many of our kids are going to post-secondary education settings, getting other training, involved in employment, and are not, which is, as our data shows 1 year later, sitting on the couch at home, that they're really engaged in life after school. What do our graduation rates look like, so that we know those students are graduating with a diploma, which we know has a significant impact on their ability to be employed. And then kind of the more negative things. What are we seeing in terms of rates of restraint and isolation, suspension and expulsion, and rates of bullying? Those are also frightening numbers for our kids with disabilities across the school system. And the question would be, if we fully fund special education the way we're talking about, can we change up some of those outcomes so they're really positive for kids with disabilities? We have some of the poorest rates of segregation in the state. And what I mean is we have poor rates of including kids. So for kids with intellectual and cognitive disabilities, there's about a 55% chance that those students are going to be segregated and isolated in a separate environment. For kids with multiple disabilities, that goes up to about 71% of time. For kids with autism, it's at about 41% of the time. So one of the things that I like to say is that, and if you want to go to the next slide, Eric, as Jim pointed out, training is really the key. So we got to make sure that we have educators who invest in our students at the principal leadership level, at the educator level, and the paraprofessional level. We have two bills that came from the Senate that are now in the House that are being looked at. Both address professional learning days for teachers. And then they have kind of a hodgepodge of other issues they try to address. For Senator Wellman, the bill 5091, which Jim pointed out really, really perfectly, is that it attempts to increase that multiplier, but it also tries to address what we do for outcomes and institutional programs for kids in our juvenile justice system, half of which are identified as students with disabilities. How do we look at safety net changes so that it's easier to access for districts? And then how do we get the state auditor to kind of help us gauge when programs are being efficient or not, and give us data and information on how to help districts in that regard so that we're providing programs that have good outcomes. And then there's another bill that Senator Braun has put forward. It's Substitute Senate Bill 5532. And it also addresses professional learning days for our educators. It also develops what are called local SEACs, so Special Education Advisory Councils. And for those of you that don't know, we have a state SEAC, which is a group that looks especially at issues for students with disabilities across our state. And this bill would suggest that every school board have a local SEAC or advisory council that it takes advice from, gets information from, uses as a place to share data around the outcomes for their kids with disabilities. And then the bill also addresses advocates for children with disabilities. So it proposes that in every ESD there would be, I think, one advocate, which doesn't really make sense if you look at issues around numbers of students that advocate would have to understand and resolve issues for. Our suggestion has been to folks who are interested in advocacy for children, which all of us are, would really be to fully fund the Governor's Office of the Education Ombuds. That's a trusted resource that's independent that families are used to going to, and it just doesn't have the funding reach to help schools and families kind of resolve their issues, especially around special ed, where a little over half of their cases involve students with disabilities. I think that might be a better solution. And then this bill also then addresses better transition planning, ensuring that DVR counselors are at exit meetings for kids with disabilities, and then having a separate advisory group that would really advise legislators, the governor's office, OSPI, on some of the larger dashboard issues, if you will, that we would use to consider success for kids with disabilities. So I think I'm about out of time. I think that I would probably say this is a great time to notice that whether you're a rural or an urban school district, we need to address these issues across the board. And I think if we do it together, we can have legislators really hear us loud and clear, between families, advocates, and school districts. When we're all on the same page, legislators certainly pay attention, because when we go in saying different things, legislators aren't quite sure how to respond. Education is a flourishing political activity, unfortunately, in our state right now. And I think, we've got to be thoughtful about what we're asking the legislature to do to solve the problems, because otherwise they may solve it in ways that none of us really appreciate or think will have a difference. And so I'm really glad that you're holding webinars like this, and I appreciate the chance to speak.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Stacy. That was wonderful. We have a little bit of time for questions. And if you do have a question, please type your question in the Q&A feature that's on the bottom of your screen. No question is too basic. And I do have a question here, actually for you, Stacy, which is, how would you say that special education in urban areas differs from special education in rural areas? Do you see differences between funding, or is it just a lack of resources for more students, or is there something else that's different?
You know, I gotta say, in terms of special education and access, I do not note a significant difference across the state. As I mentioned, OEO had about half of its cases that involved students with disabilities, and the issues were perpetual, whether it was an urban or rural district. On some level, it is about resources. So we know there are resource issues. Most of the time, it was about relationships and communication between educators and families. What are the expectations for those students? What are the relationships between the family and the school? You know, for urban districts, I think we get into these kind of crazy issues of open enrollment and magnet schools and specialty schools and alternative schools and public choice and charter schools. And, you know, at the end of the day, this is just my opinion, Stacy Dim, large urban districts sometimes collapse under their own weight, and they're often looking for ways to make schools smaller, like a rural district would. How do we have closer relationships with students? How do we ensure educators have the most contact time with students, and that we have connected families involved in education? And so that would really be the only difference, is that families might be a little more tortured navigating a large school district, trying to figure out who to talk to and who to get their attention when they don't think their child's needs are being met. But the issues themselves, in terms of outcomes, and, you know, issues around bullying, suspension and expulsion, you know, talking about the assistive technology device their student needs, or making sure that they're included and not isolated, those hit across every school district.
Great, thank you. And Jim, we actually have a similar question for you, in that, did you notice any differences when you were in Ferndale versus when you were in Davenport? They're both arguably rural districts, but one is on the west side of the state and the other is on the eastern side of the state.
I was a principal of a large middle school. Ferndale just had one middle school at that time. Now they have two. So I was at 700 7th and 8th graders in a room, or in a building. We had 43 teachers, and we were just a few bubbles on the spectrum of crazy just to make it through the day. But we all love middle school kids. So that's my perspective. But the difference that I have working in small districts and large districts that I've experienced is this larger districts sometimes have more resources readily available. They had a district-wide special ed director. Like in my little district of 540 kids, our special ed director is also pretty much a full-time. He has one period. The rest of the time, he's our elementary, middle school special ed teacher. So people wear a lot of hats. And so that's probably the biggest difference. Maybe just the availability of resources. But there are examples of amazing urban districts that are large, maybe high schools that have great, or any schools have great programs. And there's some that don't. There are some small districts that have great personalization, but there's also some small districts that really struggle. And it's all about, as Stacy said, relationships. And what I loved was the pictures that she shared on some of her slides. And because that brings home that this is all about kids, the kids we serve. And then the slide that really hit me in the face that she showed was the dropout rate of our special ed students. It's too high. And to me, that's a crisis. And in every crisis is an opportunity, and we've got to find a way. Smaller schools, by and large, were able to have collectively a higher graduation rate. And I think it's because of the personalization and because we have less kids. In larger districts, I think kids can slip through the cracks. But kids are kids, no matter where they're from, and they deserve a quality education, no matter where they're from. That's my best answer for that. It's a great question. I hope I answered it okay.
Great, thank you. Yes, I've got another one here. How would you respond to policymakers who are concerned that lifting Washington's 13.5% special education enrollment percent cap will lead to districts fraudulently over-identifying students with disabilities?
Well, Stacy might have a comment, but my comment is we're not going to do that. Most educators are high integrity, and we're going to work within the system. And every student, we have to follow the IEP. And we're not supposed to use money or resources as a barrier for implementing the IEP. And the IEP team, once they determine that that student qualifies for services, and there are standards that have to be, not standards, there are mechanisms in place that for students to qualify for an IEP. And once that happens, we need to be able to have the resources to provide that for them. And I used to work in Pomeroy, which is a small district in Eastern Washington in Garfield County, the only school district in the county. And when I was there 13 years. Our number of students that qualify for special ed was a couple years, almost 19%. And those, I can tell you firsthand, because I was at many of the meetings, the IEP and MDT meetings, those were appropriate IEPs. And we had to service those kids, even though we weren't getting the full funding. So my response to that is we've got to step up and do the right thing. That there's a fairly rigorous auditing process for districts for special ed. We have to keep files. The auditors check that very closely. And as long as we're doing the right thing, which most educators are, and then the ones that aren't, then hold them accountable. But I say to that baloney, and you need to trust the people working in the trenches trying to help our kids.
And I would just chime in with that too, as an advocate, no pun intended, but that is a long-standing urban myth. And if you look at the legislators who still sort of hang on to that, you might look at their age, because that was something that we dealt with 20 years ago. That was a fear, and it presumes a certain level of collusion and conspiracy that is just not going to happen between school psychologists, private evaluators, Children's Hospital. I mean, these are real categories of disability that are supported in diagnosis by families, by professionals that are in the medical community and the healthcare community, by educators who are observant, and the process is rigorous. I mean, you ask anybody, what is one of the bigger barriers to special ed? It's that assessment process. It's evaluation. It's making sure that we understand exactly that student's disability, where it comes from, and how it impacts education. And districts don't go through that process lightly, and neither do families, and neither do children. And it's just not going to happen.
And what happens sometimes is that a district might have a great reputation for having a great quality special ed program. So parents might move there, or if a district is in an area that has a hospital that specializes in maybe a children's hospital or a number of group homes, different situations, those districts may just be overwhelmed trying to provide services. And then to have an artificial cap that says this is only all the funding you get, and then if you want to qualify for more, as Stacy talked about, the difficulty of safety net, we've got to improve that system.
Well, and who's hurt by it are districts who have to serve by federal law every student they identify, and they dutifully do so, and they do it without getting reimbursement for that, and that's not right.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have time for just about 2 more questions, and this next one is, do you think there is a role for an app or technology to support collaboration between teachers, students, and parents around achieving IEP goals, helping students to set SMART goals and track that they are able to meet them at home and in school? And is there something that could be used to help coach students as well?
Well, we live in the land of Microsoft. You'd think that we could come up with an app for that. I have not heard of one. I do think that technology can greatly help us to be able to combine resources and get expertise that is sometimes hard to get in rural districts, so that we can make sure that kids are getting access to the kind of specialties that they need. I don't know that that's an app, but that is certainly a greater use of technology to take away some of the barriers of geography. But I do think in terms of collaboration, there's probably something there. I don't know about one though, Jim, do you?
I'd love the question. And I know there's some of our elementary teachers, I can't think of the name of the app. It's an app that they connect with parents, and it's not their phone number. It's a company that sends the message. And then it regards to messages like, tomorrow, please be sure and bring the sign-up forms, or there's a big assignment, whatever. But it's the teachers like it. What we get into is the school attorney saying, well, that's subject to public disclosure. and put requests for public records. And I'm thinking, wow, well, we still have to try and serve kids. But I like the concept of that. And to me, because we know our special ed students, they're students first. And the communication and what I like about that special ed process is the IEP, the parent has to come in at least once a year and meet and discuss the student's progress. Often it needs to be more than once a year. I think it's maybe once a year, maybe more. Stacy would know that more than I do, but that's a great process, and that works with any kids to improve communication. So if an app or technology can help that, I like the concept.
Yeah, I think one of the most difficult complaints I hear from families is they just want a little more communication with the school, and any way to ease that level of communication that you described would be fantastic without it having to take, teachers calling at 6 o'clock at night every time, or parents having to come track down the parent educator to understand, what's happening and how can they help or what's going on. Critical.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We have time for one final question, which is, since it appears that the House budget proposal is about to close the special education funding gap by about only $71 million compared to OSPI's recommended $300 to $400 million, what can we as parents do to close this special education funding gap?
I think you have to get engaged, and you have to put the pressure on legislators respectfully. You don't want to offend them, because it's hard to influence somebody that you offend. But I think real facts speak, and the legislature recognizes, the leaders recognize we've got a problem. We're not fully funding special ed. We're not adequately funding special ed. And I think to hear the stories and just to respectfully say we've got to increase this, and what's the plan? I hope it doesn't take McCleary 2. There's some that say McCleary 2 will be a lawsuit brought from districts or parents or even students that they're not being funded adequately for the services they need through special ed. I hope we don't have to go to the court system again.
Yeah, I hope not to. Yeah. I hope not to.
Stacy might have more to add on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, advocacy is important, and legislators listen. It would be easier if parent advocates and superintendents and educators were all sitting together in the same room saying the same thing to their legislators and demanding that. Lawsuits often go in a direction that, even the original litigants don't expect to go in. So there's always risk in litigation. And our state is litigation weary. Why does a legislator need to have that in front of them to respond? That shouldn't be the case. It really just takes us having more conversations and in unity talking to our legislators.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. And one vehicle for that is our coalition that's fairly new, the Investing in Student Potential Coalition, which you can find at studentpotential.org. And Stacy, thank you so much for being part of the steering committee in that coalition. That's been really wonderful support that you and Ramona have been giving us. And Jim, thank you so much for participating as well. Both of you have been wonderful. I just want to say thank you so much for all the wisdom and perspective that you gave us today. And I want to say thank you also to all of you who've been on this webinar. Our next webinar will focus on student supports and access to mental health services. We will post our information on our website soon, and we'll share on social media. Thank you again for joining us today. If you have any additional questions or comments, please send them to me, Eric, spelled A-R-I-K, @educationvoters.org. A recording of today's presentation will be available on our website, educationvoters.org. And feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. If you'd like to learn more about League of Education Voters or support our work, please visit our website, educationvoters.org. Thanks again for attending, and I hope that you will join us at future webinars.